That's interesting. Is this crashing? So I rebooted and it's having the same crash, and yeah, as Jenny mentioned, this stream transcode VM is on the same server. Sorry about that. I forgot about that too. Yeah, and I'm getting, so I tried running the same file that crashed before, and I'm getting the same exception. Or it looks like it could be the same exception at least. It's hard to tell from here, but it's also in downloading this buffer here, the square sum. So one possible theory is that there's something that this does which messes with the internal state of the GPU firmware and will break things after this point. We could just try running an older file to see if that's the case. Like one that I know I've been able to process successfully already. Okay, I'm going to run the January file in that same output directory. Or the last file I have for January. And that seems okay. Like, I wonder if there's some way for a DMA to fail that then causes that DMA resource to get used up until rebooting. Oh. What the heck? Because I've been able to process this entire file successfully before. Well, we could reboot again, although... Gosh, it's annoying that this is on the same computer that I'm doing my stream transcode from. Well, we could just put this off until I'm not streaming. And maybe right now try to debug the not a number thing. Well, let's try James had a good suggestion to try asking for more verbosity from CUDA memcheck. We could do that. I think most of the fan noise you're hearing is my ZFS scrub right now. Yeah. 30% CPU just check something. Program must end with CUDA device reset to check leaks. Interesting. I don't think we need that. This does not act like a memory leak. I think I already had print level set to the maximum, which was info. Oh, Mr. Radar points out that YouTube thinks this is a brand new stream. That's frustrating. Well, I'm like running out of steam for this anyway though, so I don't know if we're gonna get that much further. I was hoping to go deeper into libavcodec stuff, but I think we're hitting somewhat more fundamental problems than I thought we were gonna hit. Maybe I can at least like read some documentation on this to start the libavcodec gears turning. Jessica has an off-topic question. They're wondering what my opinion is on open source hardware, and will it be as big as open source software? Will it need more precise definition? I mean, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure what you mean by big. Like, is the goal here to get everyone talking about open source software? Is it to get everyone writing it, using it, supporting it? And like, what do you want out of open source hardware? Do you want people like making really expensive devices that require huge amounts of natural resources, but they're fully documented? You know, do you want people, you know, fully documenting devices that no one can actually have? You know, like I feel like open source hardware is part of the story of how one goes about making hardware that is potentially long-lasting and good for a diverse group of people. But I don't know, like, open source hardware seems like a weird thing to approach on its own. It seems like something to do in service of a goal. So Josie's asking mostly about how there's a spider web on the camera that's been bugging me. They're asking, just in general, writing a DIN standard about it. I'm so lost. You're wondering if it's in general good to be more open about hardware. I mean, for most people, yeah. I mean, it's only people who have, you know, something to gain from the hardware not being open that wouldn't want it to be open. There are different people that fall into those categories. Like there's, you know, companies and individuals that are making money off of existing intellectual property. There's people who are worried about stuff that they make being used in ways that they can't control, and so they would rather control it. You know, and like, I mean, it's like almost perpendicular from a lot of the concerns about access and ethics that I think are often more relevant in hardware. So like, open source hardware is great. Like I certainly think it's great to use and create as much open source hardware as you can, but it's like a weird thing to approach on its own as a goal, because it seems like almost perpendicular to the actual goals that I can see. I would actually say that with open source software, you have a lot of those same concerns about how, like, humans still need to do the work to make it happen. I mean, the resources it requires to make software are much different from the resources it takes to make hardware, and you end up with different amounts of additional resources required to distribute what you've created. I don't know, so far I'm not really sure what you're asking. The question seems to be really vague, and so it seems like perhaps the start of a discussion rather than something that it's possible to answer. Because I would actually say that it is not actually easy to add your contribution to open source software intrinsically. Like that position comes from having experience and, you know, having the environment that you need to help out with the software. Like, even if it does not require the consumption of additional new physical resources beyond like power and maintaining your existing equipment, like it's still not free to write software, even if it's nice to think that it is sometimes. Because like open source hardware and open source software both kind of have this promise of freedom for some of the users, but like it's hard to see that that's actually accomplishing the goal that I think people want it to have. So I don't know that I would use it as an end unto itself, but a framework for achieving some other goal. So like I think a lot of people have this goal in making open source hardware that they want to make something which is easier to build upon, easier to understand, you know, easier to feel this certain kind of design freedom that I think many of us are really attached to when you're building something using an open source design. You know, it's sort of a way of creating a design that appears in some way to be like self-contained, to be made from other pieces that are also open, to be kind of free to use in whatever way. It's this like solid block. It's like something you can stand on top of and not have to worry about it just crumbling. So I think open source hardware feels good like that for a lot of us. But then the concerns you bring up, like, well, with hardware you actually have to build it. You can't just have a computer and contribute to it. I mean, I think that's just a slightly thicker version, like a more congealed version of the same problem that you have with software. Like with software, you need to get to some point where you actually have the ability to not just replicate what other people have done, but extend it. And it's not just free. It's like doing research. Like it's like replicating someone else's experiment. Emily's asking, would you consider an FPGA core implementing a given architecture that anyone can use to be open hardware, as like a VHDL file or something, not a binary? Yeah, I mean, that seems like it would pretty clearly fall within the definition of open hardware. What I'm trying to say here is not necessarily that open hardware isn't good or that it isn't something that exists. I'm just saying that the question that you posed to me did not seem to have an answer that made sense. So I'm trying to understand what that question really leads to. Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to take conversational prompts. Like I said earlier in the stream that I was hoping this could be a bit more conversational than usual, so I'm happy with how that's been going. Anyway, just to back up a sec, or zoom out a sec, so I was hoping the thing I could do here would be to work on the video summary tool and improve it. It seems like at this point I've got sort of a weird set of potential problems where the video summary tool is failing in ways that I did not expect it to fail. Debugging these failures likely involves rebooting this computer a whole bunch, which I can't do without killing the stream, unfortunately. This is making me kick myself for moving this to a VM. Like maybe I should just move the VM back to a physical machine, use some more electricity. Yeah. Like, I think Emily's on to, like, pulling on a good thread here. Emily says that if you consider the licensing, the manufacturing, the IP costs as things that need to be defined for open hardware, and then what level of capability or capital should be expected in order to participate or contribute. Yeah. So I think sometimes maybe this resonates with some of you. Um, oh, what was it? There's a specific example I want to pick on, but I don't know if I remember the example well enough to actually pick on it. Um, I don't know. It was something like the Open Computing Initiative or something like that. You see this a lot. Uh, there are these projects that companies start that have open in the name, and then you kind of have to do some mental gymnastics to figure how that actually relates to your definition of open in order to figure out how much of that name to take seriously. Um, and so I feel like I've seen these projects that say they're open, but when you dig below the surface, you realize, oh, actually, this is open for a very specific set of people. Like, this is useful for other big companies that are doing this particular thing, or it's useful for people who are making some other kind of product. It says it's open because it's not completely closed, not because it's actually open for everyone. So, yeah, the level of openness, um, like that's I feel like that's important for software and for hardware and for culture, like anything where you want a bunch of stakeholders to participate, right? Like, let's say this is just a democracy and you want to know, like, oh, all these people that I'm supposed to be representing, how many of them want me to do the thing? Well, do you ask them to vote? How many of the people actually understand what the thing is? Like, how many of the people are going to take the time to vote, even if you do take the time to, like, pose the question in a way that they're all going to understand? And, like, even doing a very basic thing by today's standards, like a basic representative democracy, is not actually straightforward because everyone has limited time and attention and capacity. So, and then like open source is like, it's like that. It's like, well, you've got a bunch of stakeholders and you want them to have the ability to have more agency in this world that they're in. So it's not necessarily centralized in the same way that a government is, but in some ways it is, because you're working with this economy of scale as far as the labor necessary to produce some software or hardware. Like, fundamentally, that's what open source is. It's this agreement that we're all going to share some of our labor with each other, and we're all going to share some of this stuff, which is the congealed results of our labor, with each other. And it seems like a pretty raw deal if someone is like offering you a thing that they know that you don't need in exchange for something that they, of course, need. The problem I have often when I'm trying to just be more reflective or talk more about just like how any of this is supposed to work. Like okay, we're doing all this open source hardware. How is that supposed to help anyone again? It's like this just depresses people. It's like I feel like this is why I don't have these kinds of conversations often. It's like either I end up talking to people who don't know enough about the field to have really any opinion about it, or I feel like I'm talking with people who are just like so deep in it that these questions are unanswerable and depressing. I don't know where else to go to get some other inputs that are not just depressing. Or it's like on I feel like the cliche is like on Twitter everyone is like an infosec person who can't be bothered to care about anything except their, I don't know, I'm getting too negative. Like there's a lot to like in a lot of these communities that I find myself wanting to push away. I just like infosec. I just don't want to be around infosec people these days. I want to find other stuff because I feel like I tried that. I tried being around InfoSec people, and it just made me really depressed because the stuff that they cared about was stuff that I did not want to care about. Like I don't want to be a snake oil salesman, and I don't want to be like peddling fear, and I don't want to be living in a world where everything is always a threat 100% of the time. And I think those are some of the problems I have with InfoSec. There are aspects of it that I like, for sure. It's full of some great little tech puzzles, but I don't know if I can if I can sustain myself on that, or like art. I feel like art was alright for a while, and some parts of that worked out, but then the whole thing where like you're making these extremely useless objects that sit in a place and people look at them, and then there's this whole kind of stratified structure that builds up around what people think of the objects and where they sit. And I think most of these communities are pretty bleak if you don't know where to find the good in them. But then I don't know where to find people that can lead me toward something that's worthwhile in these communities. Like I tend to run in there mostly alone, and then I'll like post something cool and get some Reddit points or whatever, and then realize that all the other people I'm running into are terrible, and then turn the other direction. And they're not always terrible. Like I said earlier, one example of a community that I find is often like a good positive example out there is Adafruit, but then like the stuff that they tend to care about is often stuff that I don't really care about. And so it's cool, I like that they exist, but I don't really find a place for myself in there very much. It's a funny question. Sorry, I'm a little behind on chat now. That's an interesting angle, is like what is the relationship between open hardware and philanthropy? I think a lot of us have this idea that in the abstract it's a good and useful and philanthropic thing to put more reusable ideas out into the commons. And I think I agree with that. I think it's also just a really weak form of philanthropy. Like, very few of the people that need help right now are going to be relieved in any way by you posting your pet project on the internet, And I mean, I feel that too. It's like I feel this conflict really deep inside me. It's like the thing that I feel I'm most capable of doing is making weird little specific niche projects and putting them on the internet for all the world to enjoy. And in reality, the world mostly doesn't care because they're busy trying to like pay rent and pay for healthcare. So that's why I still feel like this question of like open hardware is really perpendicular to the question of like, are you doing a good thing? Like they don't seem to be extremely related at all. Like you could be making something which is just not a good product. Like it's harmful for people, it's harmful for the environment, or like it's useless or whatever. It could just be not a good product for whatever reason, and it could be completely open. And it could even be a good opportunity for people to learn. Like it could be something that is very well documented and well thought out, and if you read it, you can just understand some huge portion of the entire field of making these devices. like that would be an amazing resource, and it could still be a terrible project because the thing itself is actually not good for whatever reason. So, I mean, I feel like open hardware, you have to remember that that is very specifically about access to the designs behind the device. And it's even more specific than that. Like, you don't need any kind of open hardware just to get like a picture of the circuit board. Like, you could just take a picture of the circuit board. You could take a picture of each layer after taking the components off. It wouldn't even be copyright protected. But the design, like, what if you actually want to know how something is designed? Do you want the source code? I mean, maybe, but the source code isn't even really the most straightforward way to find out how something is designed. That would be a design document or somebody writing a blog post about how they felt when they were designing it or something. So Josique is wondering, they just want a more clear answer for what exactly open source hardware even is. Like, when is the documentation you've provided enough? And that's a good question. It's like, well, what are you trying to do? Like, open source itself, I don't think that says anything about how reproducible the design is. Like, can we make an analogy to like scientific research? Like, open access research means you have a copy of the paper. It doesn't mean the paper's right. It doesn't mean you know how to reproduce it. It doesn't mean you have the materials to reproduce it. It doesn't mean it's even possible to reproduce, but you have a copy of the paper, which is a big step. It's like way more than we often have. And that's kind of what open hardware is about, I think. It's like not a guarantee that you can make the thing. It might be entirely made out of unobtainium parts that went obsolete 20 years ago and never sold for under $100,000 a unit. Like, it might just be actually impossible to make. But you have the documentation. So obviously you can game that system and you can release just like the minimum amount of documentation to satisfy some arbitrary rule or some arbitrary intermediary. So I think usually you see the definition as having some kind of rule in it that the thing that you release is supposed to be comparably useful as the actual original design files that you would have been using. So you can't just release like a picture of the circuit board. You actually have to release like the Eagle files or the Altium files or whatever, which all have their own problems. Like, you need that program, you need all the other knowledge and hardware and everything else, but it's this baseline that at least puts people on more of a level playing field. And then they add, if you want to make that particular piece of open source hardware that they've released, should I have a PDF? Should I make a video? So yeah, I mean, I think this is separate from the definition of open source hardware. Like, I think what you're getting into is how good is this project at teaching, which is not really what open source hardware is about. Open source hardware, at least the way I understand it and the way I usually see it explained, is about preventing manufacturers from putting up additional barriers in the intellectual property. So it prevents you from having secret design files that are separate from the public design files. I think some open source definitions I've seen even would specify that the format has to be editable in some software, which is widely available. So that would rule out something like Altium in favor of something like KiCad or maybe even Eagle, maybe. But yeah, I mean, that's a definition that I think you ask different people and they'll say different things. It's like, what software would, what's the software availability requirement? What's the editability requirement? Like, a lot of open source hardware wouldn't include a detailed bill of materials. It would just include a schematic. And some people are okay with that. Some people need a bill of materials. If you have a bill of materials, what if they're all from one manufacturer and that one manufacturer goes out of business or doesn't ship to your country or, any other number of reasons? The parts all go obsolete. Yeah, and Altium is a good example, as Jenny says, of something that you can use to either intentionally or unintentionally make something less accessible to people. But it isn't, I don't think it's as cut and dry. Like, it isn't just an issue of what software you use. Like, is it worse to design something in Altium or to use a BGA part? Like, what makes it less accessible? Is it Like, what if you have a design that's designed in completely open tools, but requires a CPU that's $150 each? Like, I mean, is that better than just selling a finished product for $150? Like, is that more or less open? And I think this is where a lot of open source definitions really fall down, is they don't understand the depth of the supply chain. And I mean, this is, I think, what really does separate open source hardware from open source software, is that open source software often tries to reach some definition of purity, whether it's all the CPU or all the instructions that the CPU runs are open, or everything in user space is open, or everything in this one .exe file or .so or whatever is open. I think in open source software, you do feel, I do see people reaching for these purity milestones where, oh, as long as everything in this file is mine, I don't have to care what else is in this file, or what else is on the CPU, or as long as everything running on the CPU is open, I don't have to care about the firmware running on your keyboard, I don't have to care about system management mode, I don't have to care about the BIOS or the boot chain or any of these other things that can be just as important for understanding what your CPU is doing in the present. So, like with software, there's this tendency to want to put up these lines in the sand where you can say that, well, this is mine and that's yours. I mean, with hardware, you have to put up those lines just in order to compose products together. Like, you can't like make an entire cell phone on a single silicon wafer, at least not today. And it's always a process of buying things and integrating them and designing them and integrating them. So, like in software, I think people often, like, they draw that line in the sand once and they say, okay, everything on the CPU is mine. I run GNU/Linux and whatever, and I don't have to care about system management mode, and I'm just going to stick my thumbs in my ears when people talk about keyboard firmware. And that is where a lot of people are in the software world. But then you look at hardware and you just kind of can't do that. You start out in hardware by composing things that you've bought together, by plugging in the Lego bricks. Like, you can't start from nothing in hardware unless you want to spend like a year making your own transistor and then not have enough to make an adder. So, whereas you can pretty much start from that exact line in the sand in software. You can just say, I don't care about hardware, I want all my software to be open, and that doesn't include firmware and microcode and whatever. And once you've done that, once you've made that particular ideological concession to what the entire system is, you can start from scratch and just build up. And so I think a lot of people that are only familiar with software are kind of stuck in that ideology where it is possible to know everything and it's possible to be everything. And you don't have to think about the boundaries between systems as much, and the boundaries between systems that are not part of the same design or part of the same intellectual property domain or whatever. And in hardware, that just always happens. You buy a thing, you have specifications, you have to some extent, rely on the specifications, but you also kind of just have to build stuff without necessarily having a complete picture of all the information. Tuco is joining us. This is like most of what my robot does now, is move between these two positions. Actually, a lot of what I'm doing is dodging that orb light sculpture thing, so once I finish taking that apart, we'll have less to dodge. Oh gosh, Nan. Where are those Nans coming from? Hmm. Debug option 2. The command line argument processor I'm using right now is not very smart. I mean, I think that was a deliberate choice. I guess I just don't quite agree with it, which is different from it not being smart. But it assumes that everything after the first file name is also a file name, so it assumed the -d here was also a file name. Oh yeah, in debug mode it actually prints out a line for every input frame, not just for every output frame. Seems to be running a lot slower too. Maybe it's just me. Or maybe it's crashing again. Yay. Well, don't worry, I won't reboot the machine without thinking about it again. Although, yeah, it's starting to seem like I should not have my streaming VM on this computer. I don't have just a bunch of extra computers to run this on necessarily. So I mean, I'm about to tell you all the bunch of computers I have here, but so I have like 3 rack mount machines in this rack right here. One of which is the file server, which you can hear right now because it's syncing the RAID. Usually it's quieter. And then there's the workstation I'm streaming from, and there's this workstation that you see on the video window. The streaming workstation does not have nearly enough free CPU right now. And, well... I mean, I can't... I used to run it on the file server, but it makes the fan spin up even more, so I don't really want to do that while I'm recording. I might just put this back on a physical machine, and then put the physical machine in the closet and have it heat up the isopods. Can I run this on a VM on my isopod machine? I don't know if it has enough free CPU, though. And then the isopod stream will skip when I'm streaming this. I think I just need to throw more hardware at the problem eventually. Do the physical to virtual to physical migration. Yeah, I wonder if this is some kind of memory leak, like within the device. It processed, what, 43 input frames, but didn't actually get to do any output frames before it crashed, which is, it did more than that last time. Is this consistent if I run in the same thing again? Cat legs. Ah, this cat is so good. Duke's licking my fingers. Well, it takes the same amount of time to crash. Maybe I can investigate this crash without rebooting. So the reason I was rebooting is because it seems like this causes some kind of somewhat durable change in the state of the GPU, such that even when I run stuff that used to succeed, it fails. And so much of debugging is trying to find you know, what is the thing on each side of the failure and try to narrow those in on the actual problem. Alright, so this is part of OpenCV. Cap FFmpeg implementation. So the way this works is a little bit weird. The actual OpenCV library here is OpenCV Video I/O. There's a different version of that for CUDA, which we're using for the decode side. But for encode, as I mentioned in an earlier stream, the encode CUDA stuff is out of date and doesn't actually work with current drivers. So I'm not using that. Not a huge problem because video encoding is not really a performance bottleneck in this program. So I'm using the normal non-CUDA video encode, which is OpenCV Video I/O. But then it actually internally has another DLL, like another shared object file that it uses for FFmpeg support, which I think is for licensing reasons. I think they want to be able to build the GPL'd version of FFmpeg without having to build the whole app GPL'd. Something like that. I mean, I don't think that's actually how this is configured right now either. I don't think I'm using the GPL'd FFmpeg, but for some reason they wanted it to be a separate library, probably licensing of some sort, and so there's this additional boundary. And then cap FFmpeg impl, I think, is for that inner library, which I'm forgetting the name of. Yeah, and then if I remember right, this actually has two separate interfaces. There's one interface for dealing with compressed packets of video, which is then in turn used by the CUDA codec. And then there's a higher level interface for dealing with pictures, like video frames. But I don't think there's any audio support in here currently. I also don't know how the multi-threading for this works. I mean, I want to be doing the video encoding on a separate thread from launching the CUDA kernels. I don't know if it's got some kind of asynchronous layer or if I'm going to need to do that. I think this interrupt callback was about connecting FFmpeg to external data sources. I don't remember specifically. And I'm guessing that based on the configuration here, it looks like this is set up to use... I mean, I think that based on what I remember from the CMake run earlier, this is set up to use its own internal copy of FFmpeg. And then based on what's highlighted here in the pound defines, or in the pound ifs, it seems like it's maybe an old version. Anyway, I think that was all for decode. I'm actually going to want encode. Yeah, I looked at this stuff earlier because I figured, oh, this has properties. Maybe there's a property for like keyframe information or something, and no, it's all stuff that's much more basic than that. Yeah, even fewer properties on the set side. Video writer. So this is maybe something to look into. It looks like there are two different APIs, an old one and a new one. And this seems to be the new one. Here's the bitrate params that you can't override. Thanks. I'm sure it's going to be somewhat subtle to get the timing correct with the video and the audio. Part of why I want this to be done in a single program is so that I can do the audio-video synchronization once and correctly, and then not have to worry about the synchronization. That is not actually taking effect here. I think that's only for MPEG. I vaguely remember seeing the parameters for H.264 here. I think they were elsewhere. Yeah, dealing with data buffer alignment here. Oh, software scaler. We don't need that, but it's nice to know it's here. That's a separate library, I think. libavcodec or something like that. Okay, so the new API has AV codec encode video 2. Oh my gosh, Tuco is looking great right here. Well, I might call it a night here too in just a sec. I feel like I'm getting low on stuff to do in this stream that is actually streamable, but if anybody's got some last questions or anything, I'm happy to talk for a bit more. I'm just running low on easily streamable ideas here, and I might need another break soon. Everything in computers is just so bad. It's like, this comment I'm staring at is To ensure that doesn't happen, we pad the step multiple, or step to a multiple of 32. That's the minimal alignment for which Valgrind doesn't raise any warnings. It's like, no, we didn't actually document what alignment the library needs, nor did we figure out what instructions that requirement comes from and look at its documentation. We just tried it with Valgrind. I feel like it's been a meme for a long time that software as an engineering profession doesn't, like, it hasn't really grown up in the same way as most engineering professions, you know? It's like maybe thousands of years ago when humans built a bridge, they just kind of looked at it and they thought, it's about right. And then if somebody died crossing the bridge, they just thought, oh, that's bad. We should just do that differently next time. But nowadays, that's not usually how bridges work, right? But it's what we do with software. And I feel like this was a really common thing that we would talk about in the software engineering field a while ago. And I don't know if it's as common now. I don't know if it's that people are now just more used to things being so bad everywhere, or what. Obscure bug fix that silences warnings in the default analysis. Oh. Are we serious with AV codec encode video 2? Oh, I think somehow I put Visual Studio on top of everything else, including the taskbar. That's what I get for using the mouse one-handed. I just tried searching for AV codec encode video 2, and of course the first answer is Stack Overflow, and then a couple answers below, or a couple results below, is a GitHub issue from some other project that depends on FFmpeg about how that function, AV codec encode video 2, is deprecated. Oh, some other good questions. Oh my gosh, that Patreon intro. I've been needing to make a new Patreon intro video for so long. It's just, I feel like my problem now is I don't really know what I'm doing, so I don't know how to describe that to people. But I think the music would be in the description. Oh, my hair was so tiny in that video. I've always interacted with the world by making things and by taking
Oh,
part.
that's why I didn't credit it.
And this was my reality. I had kind of a weird, just barely graduating university, not to look too closely at the software you're getting. Found the most kind of enjoyment out of and engaging things itself.
I don't know why the audio is all distorting all of a sudden. Anyway, I think that was actually the music that I wrote for this orb thing that's hanging right over here.
And this was my reality. I had kind of a weird childhood, and it was hard for me to connect with other people. But I could make things, and it was like I could make my own tiny worlds. It wasn't really the things themselves that I got attached to. I loved that experience of deeply understanding something, of creating.
Yeah. There's something wrong with my audio feed because I've got no audio on the left side and crackly audio on the right side. So sorry about that. But yeah, that was I think that was the background music I made for Eclipse, which is actually not on my art site because I haven't made a video about it or anything yet. But the tracks are actually on GitHub of all places. Yeah, so I try to be really good about crediting everything I use that is not mine, but that in that case that music was something I made a while ago. Do I have Ableton on here? I guess so. Yeah. So this is a pretty short file, like it just loops, but the program that runs the art piece this was designed for, it kind of changes the way it changes the like levels and enable for the tracks each time through to kind of make it sound a little different. I should say I don't really know what I'm doing with music. Mostly this is just me messing with stuff until I find sounds that I like, and I don't really have any music background. I just try stuff and sometimes it works. I should recycle more of this music. I feel like I've been trying to do that for videos. It's like whenever I'm looking for music, I'll look through some of the stuff I made to see if any of it works, and sometimes I can recycle it. Because I made this pretty much just for that one art piece, but yeah, it was nice that I could use it at least somewhere else. This cat's pretty chill. Well, maybe this is a good stopping point. I feel like I did a bunch of emotional stuff on this stream, and maybe I can come back later after letting some of that digest. Yeah. Well, thanks everyone for coming by. I appreciate all of your help and encouragement, all your monthly Patreon donations, all your objects that arrive at my P.O. box, and all your warm wishes and cat hugs and everything else. I'll try to keep this going, and I think the next, well, what would be the next thing? Let me know what you think I should stream about next. As far as the stuff I've been doing off camera, I've got just like a big problem to figure out in terms of how I want to actually edit down the next couple of videos into something which has a satisfying narrative to it and is not just a project time lapse or whatever. So that's going to be something I'm pretty busy with, but let me know if you have ideas about that, and if there's anything I can do for that that fits into a stream format, I'll certainly be looking out for that. But there might also just be a lot of off-camera work to do for that. I'm also, like, I need to do more debugging on this video summary thing because I want to make more progress on running it. And at the very least, like, the thing that's bottlenecking February's isopod compilation is having some kind of audio processing tool that doesn't crash after 2 gigabytes. So maybe I'll get some more of the just kind of flaily introductory stuff taken care of on my own, and then we can do some more of the nice substantive stuff together, or maybe we just come back to this right as it is. I don't know. Doesn't seem terrible either way. Well, yeah, thanks so much for stopping by. I will see you all next time. Happy hacking. Oh, I wanted to make Tuco bigger, but this is as big as he gets right now.